Welcome to New Jersey, the most densely populated state in America that sits on top of more toxic waste than anywhere else in the country. New Jersey packs 1,300 residents into every square mile. Alaska has 1.3. That density made the state a corridor between New York and Philadelphia, a hub for factories and warehouses and chemical plants that operated for decades before anyone asked what happened to the waste. Here is the number that matters. New Jersey has more than 150 federal Superfund sites. It has 14,000 known contaminated locations scattered across 9,000 square miles. It has the highest concentration of hazardous waste per square mile in the nation. But here is where it gets worse. Beneath the highways and the suburbs and the stadium parking lots, fires have been burning underground for decades. At one landfill in Jersey City, the ground caught fire around 1970 and did not stop burning until 1985. 15 years. Flames rose through the soil as if from hell itself. Firefighters eventually refused to respond. The risks were too great. This is not just a story about garbage. This is a story about what happens when an entire state buries its industrial past and waits for the ground to catch fire. New Jersey should not exist as it does. It is a sliver of land wedged between two of the largest cities in America, stretched thin along 130 miles of coastline, crossed by more highways per square mile than any other state in the nation. The New Jersey Turnpike opened in 1951 and transformed the marshlands into a corridor for commerce. The Garden State Parkway followed in 1957, stitching the suburbs to the shore. Factories that needed access to ports and rail lines found cheap land between Newark and Trenton. Warehouses that needed proximity to Manhattan found room in the meadows west of the Hudson. The geography that made New Jersey valuable also made it vulnerable. Every factory that opened generated waste. Every warehouse that processed goods discarded packaging and chemicals and materials that had to go somewhere. And for decades, somewhere meant the wetlands. A 1970 study prepared for the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission identified 51 individual locations where solid waste was being dumped within the Meadowlands district alone. That count did not include the sites where midnight dumpers routinely disposed of waste without permits or oversight. The practices at that time were characterized as dump and push operations. Trucks arrived at the landfill, unloaded their contents, and a machine pushed loads on top of previous deposits or over the edge into the marsh. There was no compaction. There was no covering. Debris eroded in an uncontrolled manner. Waste was dumped directly into the Hackensack River with no environmental controls in place. By 1969, nearly 1,900 acres of the Meadowlands were unregulated landfills. Fire at these sites were commonplace. For context, consider what the landfills accepted. The Kinbuck landfill in Edison Township operated from the late 1940s until 1976. During that time, it received 70 million gallons of liquid toxic waste and 1 million tons of solid waste. Large quantities of polychlorinated biphenyls were dumped without proper containment. The PCBS leaked into Edmonds Creek, a tributary of the Raritan River. The state ordered the landfill closed in 1977. Cleanup operations continued into the 2000s. In 2005, polluters agreed to pay $2.6 million toward ongoing remediation. The Jones Industrial Services landfill in South Brunswick accepted industrial, agricultural, and institutional wastes, tree stumps, dead animals, junk automobiles, chemicals, and waste oils. Approximately 50,000 cubic yards of waste were deposited annually. In 1975, the EPA sampled drinking water from a residence next to the landfill. Analysis revealed high levels of volatile organic compounds. The state concluded the landfill was the source. At the PJP landfill in Jersey City, 200 truckloads of waste arrived every day. Most of the waste came in barrels. Hazardous chemicals including methylene, naphthalene, toluene, phenanthrene, and ethylbenzene were poured into the site.
The dumping continued from 1969 until the landfill was officially shut down in 1974. Other sources claim dumping continued for years afterward. Jersey City police alleged that illegal dumping was common knowledge as late as 1982. Here is the number that matters. New Jersey has more Superfund sites than any other state in the nation. The United States Geological Survey has documented that the state boasts the largest number of known hazardous waste sites per square mile of any state, with 638 multiple source, multiple media, multiple contaminant sites according to state records. A 2020 investigation by ProPublica found nearly 14,000 contamination sites scattered across the state. In 2009, the state legislature mandated that the Department of Environmental Protection rank every contaminated site in order of urgency and severity. The first list was supposed to be published in 2010. 3 years later, the state auditor faulted the agency as non-compliant. As of 2020, no rankings had been published. The crux is we are relying on the market to drive cleanups and not prioritizing sites with the deepest levels of contamination. That assessment came from Environment New Jersey. The most expensive sites are allowed to lie fallow unless the market has a reason to clean them up. A 2015 investigation found that nearly 3/4 of New Jersey residents living below the poverty line were within 1 mile of a contaminated site that had no cleanup plan. The state said all those sites posed low risks. The state also never published the rankings that would prove it. But here is what nobody expected. The buried waste did not stay buried. It caught fire, and when it did, it burned for 15 years. The PJP landfill sat on 87 acres of riverfront land on the west side of Jersey City, tucked beneath the Pulaski Skyway, where Sip Avenue intersects with routes 1 and 9. The Skyway itself was an engineering marvel when it opened in 1932, a hulking steel structure that carried traffic across the Hackensack and Passaic rivers and over the marshlands that nobody wanted to cross on foot. Drivers passing overhead could see the wetlands stretching toward Manhattan. They could see the industrial facilities lining the riverbanks. And starting around 1970, they could see something else: flames coming up through the ground. The fires at PJP were not ordinary fires. They did not burn on the surface where water and foam could reach them. They burned underground, fed by the decomposing waste and the chemicals that had been buried in barrels for years. The flames appeared to rise from the earth itself, yellow and orange fingers clawing through the soil. They burned day and night. They cast a noxious pall of thick gray smoke across the nearby Freeman Avenue housing projects and Holy Name Cemetery. Motorists on the Skyway choked on fumes that wafted up from below. Here is how it happens. When organic waste decomposes in a landfill, it produces gas. Landfill gas is roughly a 50-50 mix of methane and carbon dioxide. Methane is highly flammable. When it concentrates in an enclosed space at between 5% and 15% of the total air volume, it becomes explosive. The decomposition process also generates heat. Temperatures rise deep within the buried waste. If that heat encounters a pocket of methane and a source of ignition, whether from a spark, a damaged battery, or spontaneous combustion, the result is fire. But underground fires do not behave like surface fires. Water cannot reach them. Foam cannot smother them. The fire spreads through the waste mass along pathways that shift as the material settles and compacts. Operators who attempted to extinguish the blaze at PJP discovered that every time one vent of fire was squelched, another would flare up elsewhere. The subterranean inferno went through deceptive periods of apparent dormancy, only to erupt again. Sometimes flames burst through several feet of snow. The fires at PJP burned from approximately 1970 to 1985, 15 years. The Jersey City Fire Department responded again and again. They put out the flames. The flames returned. Eventually, the fire chief refused to send any more firefighters. The risks were too great. For context, underground landfill fires can smolder for weeks, months, or years at a time. They produce carbon monoxide at toxic levels near the surface. They undermine the structural integrity of the landfill itself, causing sinkholes and collapses. They release volatile organic compounds, petroleum hydrocarbons, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons into the air. All of these contaminants can migrate from the soil into the groundwater. Residents of the Marion neighborhood, adjacent to the landfill, smelled the smoke on a regular basis for over a decade. Citizens complained. Demonstrations were held. Public officials eventually spoke out. In 1985, approximately 1,500 people took to the streets on the west side of Jersey City to demand action. It was not an everyday occurrence, but what drove them to protest was happening nearly every day. The only firm capable of handling the inferno was Boots & Coots, a Texas company that would later gain national attention for extinguishing the oilfield fires in Kuwait after the Persian Gulf War. They were contracted to snuff out the blaze at PJP. Suddenly gone were the hellish flames that had clawed through the oily riverbanks for 15 years. No more did the choking stench and billowing plumes envelop the Skyway's motorists. The New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection installed a firebreak trench to prevent the spread of underground fires if they occurred again. They regraded and capped and reseeded 45 acres of the landfill. They installed a gas venting system to prevent the buildup of methane. They excavated and recompacted over 1 million cubic yards of contaminated materials. They removed thousands of buried drums. No fires have occurred at PJP since then, but the 1985 protest and its aftermath became symbolic of how the community around the site had been treated throughout the landfill's history. The fires were extinguished. The toxics remained in the ground. The victory was hollow. Residents had won the resources to put out the flames, but the contamination that had been leaching into the soil and groundwater for 15 years did not disappear when the smoke cleared. The fires were out, but the damage had already migrated into something that cannot be capped or vented: the water supply. If you're still here, you now understand these weren't just landfill fires. They were chemical infernos that burned for 15 years while residents breathed the smoke. Comment 2 below if you're following this investigation, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss what comes next. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that officials tried to bury. Now let's talk about where that contamination traveled and who is still drinking it today. New Jersey relies on groundwater and surface water in roughly equal measure. The state receives an average of 44 inches of precipitation annually. The northern third was glaciated during the most recent ice age, leaving behind aquifers that generations have tapped for drinking water. Approximately 480,000 residents live or work within designated flood hazard areas. The water is everywhere, and so is the contamination. The PJP landfill is bordered on its west side by the Hackensack River. The river is used for boating and commercial shipping. It flows through the meadowlands and empties into Newark Bay. For 15 years, while fires burned underground at the landfill, chemicals leached through the soil and into the watershed. Volatile and semi-volatile compounds, petroleum hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals. All of these contaminants migrate from soil into groundwater. All of them can travel for miles. Here is what the EPA found. Because contamination levels in some areas of the groundwater remain above certain standards, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection established a classification exemption area and well restriction area for the PJP site. That designation defines an area in which the use of groundwater wells is prohibited. The contamination cannot be removed. It can only be avoided. The third EPA 5-year review of the site noted evidence that per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, known as PFAS, and other contaminants are impacting the Hackensack River. PFAS are the chemicals used in non-stick cookware, waterproof clothing, and food packaging. Scientists call them forever chemicals because they do not break down. They accumulate in human tissue. They have been linked to cancer, thyroid disorders, and immune system damage. Once they enter a water supply, they persist indefinitely. In 2023, New Jersey Attorney General Matthew Platkin and Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner Sean LaTourette announced a proposed $393 million settlement with Solvay Specialty Polymers for PFAS contamination in the vicinity of the company's facility in West Deptford. It was the first settlement of its kind to address PFAS contamination in the state. It will not be the last, but here is where it gets worse. The PJP landfill is not an isolated case, it is a pattern. At the Powhatan Valley Superfund site in Warren County, the contaminated groundwater plume stretched 9 miles at its peak. The plume contained trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene, industrial solvents that cause cancer. The contamination reached 2 public water supply wells and several private residential wells. The public wells required treatment. Residents with private wells were connected to clean public water via extended water lines. In November 2024, the state announced a $49.5 million settlement to address cleanup costs and natural resource damages. At the Jones Industrial Services landfill in South Brunswick, volatile organic compounds were detected in drinking water wells belonging to residents who lived next to the site. The state concluded that the landfill was the source. In 1975, the EPA ordered the landfill to stop accepting hazardous substances. The contamination had already spread. Groundwater treatment systems continue to operate. Monitoring is ongoing. At the Jackson Township landfill, residents complained of poor water quality in 1977. Tests revealed contamination in the groundwater. The state provided an alternate water supply for affected residents in 1980. Air and groundwater monitoring continue to this day. Here is the number that matters. Approximately 11,900 people currently reside within a 1-mile radius of the PJP landfill site. The human cost of these contaminated sites is difficult to quantify because the data has never been systematically collected. At PJP, residents of the Marion neighborhood could not use their patios or invite guests because of the smell. They reported migraines. They reported sick children. They asked officials whether their families would develop rare cancers years later from exposure to contaminated groundwater. Nobody could tell them. At the Lipari landfill in Gloucester County, the site accepted industrial waste materials from 1958 to 1971. The landfill emitted noxious vapors that caught fire on several occasions. After closure, the site continued to emit chemical odors and fumes. Nearby residents reported respiratory problems. The contamination spread to surface water, groundwater, sediment, and soil. At Toms River, dye and paint companies dumped waste in illegal landfills for decades. The groundwater was polluted for years before anyone connected the contamination to elevated rates of childhood cancer in the community. At Pompton Lakes, carcinogenic vapors migrated from factories that made war ammunition and non-stick pans into the basements of nearby homes. Residents breathed contaminated air inside their own houses. At the Diamond Alkali site in Newark, byproducts from the manufacture of the herbicide Agent Orange fouled the Passaic River. Fish and crabs became toxic. The river runs through one of the most densely populated regions in the state. The 2009 law that mandated ranking contaminated sites by urgency was supposed to ensure that the most dangerous locations remained a priority, even as the state gave private companies a bigger role in the cleanup process. The rankings were supposed to prevent the market from determining which communities received protection. The rankings were never published. A 2015 investigation found that nearly 3/4 of New Jersey residents living below the poverty line were within 1 mile of a contaminated site with no cleanup plan. The state said all of those sites posed low risks to water supplies and human health. The state also said it evaluates sites where cleanups have not started to ensure the public will have no direct exposure to contamination. The state did not explain how it makes those evaluations without the ranking system required by law. But the old contamination is not the only threat. A new one is growing faster than regulators can track.
The National Waste and Recycling Association estimates that more than 5,000 fires occur annually at recycling facilities across the country. Many of those fires are caused by lithium-ion batteries. The batteries power cell phones, laptops, and electric vehicles. They store enormous amounts of energy in compact spaces. When they are damaged, crushed, or exposed to water, they can enter thermal runaway, a chain reaction that produces heat faster than it can dissipate. The battery ignites. Materials nearby ignite. The fire spreads. A study from the association found that the rate of catastrophic fire losses at waste facilities has risen by 41% over the last 5 years. Insurance costs have increased from less than 20 cents per $100 of insured property value to as much as $10 per $100 of insured value. In Camden, a massive junkyard fire in February 2024 was likely caused by a lithium-ion battery that was wrongly delivered to a shredding facility and concealed within scrap metal. It was the 6th fire at that facility since 2021, the largest by far. County officials said it cannot happen again. In Elizabeth, a worker at a waste management facility was killed in May 2022 when a fire broke out minutes after a dumpster containing illegally dumped aerosol cans was emptied. The owner of the trucking company that disposed of the cans was indicted on charges of aggravated manslaughter. At a recycling center elsewhere in New Jersey, a firefighter was severely injured trying to extinguish flames caused by batteries that consumers had tossed in with recyclables. The federal government and New Jersey must take action to regulate the influx of these batteries into commerce. That statement came from EMR Metal Recycling after the Camden fire. Lithium-ion battery manufacturers, companies that use the batteries in their products, and end users must be regulated to ensure adequate disposal methods exist. Large penalties for those who do not comply. The old fires are out, the new fires keep starting, and the contamination keeps spreading. So what happens when a state that cannot clean up its past keeps generating more waste than ever? The math does not work. It never did. New Jersey established a statewide goal of 25% waste diversion in 1991. More than 3 decades later, the state has never achieved it. The current rate hovers around 20%, roughly where it sat 20 years ago. For every 10 items placed in a recycling bin, 3 are contaminated and end up in the landfill anyway. Researchers call this wish cycle. People toss items hoping they can be recycled without checking whether the system can actually process them. The population keeps growing. New Jersey now has approximately 9.5 million residents, the highest count ever recorded. The state adds thousands of new residents every year. More people generate more waste. More waste flows to facilities that already cannot manage what they receive. More batteries and more chemicals and more products enter a disposal system that was overwhelmed before most current residents were born. Here is the number that matters. New Jersey has 14,000 known contaminated sites and no priority ranking system. The legislature mandated the rankings in 2009. The state has never complied. The most dangerous sites receive attention when the market decides they are worth cleaning up. The rest wait. The economics work against improvement. Cleanup costs money. Monitoring costs money. Treatment systems that must operate for decades cost money. When polluters cannot be identified or have gone bankrupt, the public pays. When polluters can be identified, litigation drags on for years. The Pohankong Valley settlement announced in 2024 resolved a lawsuit filed in 2018. The contamination began decades before that. But here is where it gets worse. The climate is tightening the margins. Methane from landfills represents the 3rd largest source of that greenhouse gas in America. Landfill gas is roughly half methane and half carbon dioxide. When it escapes uncontrolled, it accelerates warming. Warming intensifies storms. Storms expose buried waste. The 1998 thunderstorm that ripped through the Sunrise Mountain landfill outside Las Vegas sent 100,000 cubic yards of garbage cascading toward the drinking water supply for 25 million people. New Jersey has thousands of capped landfills. every one of them is vulnerable to weather that exceeds the conditions they were designed to withstand. At the Kingsland landfill in the Meadowlands, methane is collected and burned to generate electricity. The flares that burn off excess gas reach temperatures of 1,700 degrees. In 2016, the Bergen County Audubon Society reported that birds flying through the invisible heat plumes were having their wings and tail feathers burned. The injuries prevented them from hunting. Some died. The New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority said it was working with federal and state agencies to find a solution. The methane keeps rising. The Superfund program was designed to clean up the worst sites. New Jersey has more Superfund sites than any other state. Many have been remediated. Remediation does not mean the contamination is gone. It means the contamination is managed. At the PJP landfill, the fires were extinguished in 1985. The site was capped. A gas venting system was installed. A warehouse and distribution center now operate on part of the property. Jersey City purchased 32 acres for a future park. The EPA calls it a success story. But the cap must be maintained. The gas venting system must be monitored. Quarterly sampling of groundwater, sediment, and surface water must continue. The 5-year reviews must be conducted indefinitely. The third review found PFAS in the Hackensack River. At the GEMS landfill in Gloucester Township, a 25-acre solar array was built on top of the capped site. The panels could not be mounted on posts driven into the ground because excavation would disturb the cap. The entire array sits on ballasted foundations. The cables run on above-ground trays instead of buried conduits. The contamination beneath the panels is contained as long as the cap holds. The cap must hold forever. At the Kinbuck landfill in Edison, a wildfire broke out in July 2022 on the former Superfund site. The fire consumed 59 acres before firefighters from Edison and the New Jersey Forest Fire Service brought it under control. Dry conditions played a role. No one was injured. 35 workers at a nearby warehouse were evacuated when smoke entered the ventilation system. The past keeps surfacing. New Jersey was always a national leader in environmental protection because it always had some of the worst environmental problems. The Spill Act of 1976 required companies responsible for contamination to clean up hazardous waste sites. It served as a model for the federal Superfund program. The state knew before anyone else how bad things could get. It wrote the laws that other states copied, but the laws have not been enough. The agencies have not been enough. The settlements and the remediation and the monitoring have not been enough. There are 14,000 sites. There are 9.5 million people packed into 9,000 square miles. There is nowhere the contamination can migrate without reaching someone. Hudson County has a population density of 15,471 people per square mile. Salem County has 198. The statewide average exceeds 1,300. When groundwater plumes travel underground, they do not respect property lines. When volatile organic compounds evaporate from soil into basements, they do not check whether the homes above are occupied. When PFAS enters the drinking water supply, it reaches everyone who drinks. The underground fires at PJP burned for 15 years before anyone could stop them. The contamination has been migrating for 50. New Jersey built the American dream on top of the American nightmare. Factories gave way to suburbs. Suburbs gave way to strip malls. And beneath it all, the buried waste kept waiting. The state has 14,000 sites and no ranking system, 9.5 million residents and nowhere to go. The Garden State grew fast, but the ground remembers everything.